Alright, you know the drill. This month I played 4 games, 2 of them were replays, but don't worry, I wrote new reviews for them, so let's get right into it. Starting off with the long-awaited finale to my Trails marathon, though some of the stank from the Cold Steel arc inevitably lingers on here. By and large, Trails into Reverie is a return to form for the Trails series. I don't see much point in comparing and contrasting the merits of the game's different routes, because they're intertwined throughout and ultimately all tell one cohesive story. Furthermore, despite the fact that 2 of the 3 main characters hail from Erebonia, it should be noted that Reverie is a Crossbell game through and through. It began development as a third Crossbell game, and the narrative is centered around Crossbell and its independence. This works out well, as historically the games in this series are at their world-building and storytelling best when they take place in Crossbell. Unlike the other 2 Crossbell games, Reverie isn't so concerned about Zemuria's politics, but that doesn't mean its world-building is lacking by any stretch of the imagination. Reverie instead ends up being the Trails game that most directly grapples with Zemuria's rapidly advancing tech industry, introducing a super-intelligent AI, Elysium, as its main antagonist. I usually don't care for these sorts of emotionally impartial concept antagonists, but it works here, as Elysium is a fascinating exploration of ideas that were planted in the background at the very beginning of the series, but haven't naturally arisen as a point of conflict until now. Reverie is also the first game in the series not to have any narrative padding. In fact, I'm almost compelled to say that the game had the opposite problem, and moved too fast at points. They really expected you to have read 3 and 9, giving only what was absolutely needed of Nadia and Swin's backstory to understand the plot. But after 9 whole games that, even at their best, tended to range from mildly to comedically bloated, I'm hesitant to complain about Reverie opting to pick up the pace a little bit. Take all of that in combination with a handful of well-conceived and well-executed plot twists I genuinely did not see C's reveal coming, and you've got a recipe for a narrative that kept me engaged for the entirety of the game's runtime. The character writing was on point here too. Throughout the Cold Steel arc, Falcom was clearly making a concerted effort to write stronger character dynamics, getting better and better with each game to the point that here in Reverie, every major character moment lands and serves to develop the characters they involve. All of Reverie's protagonists experience significant and satisfying character growth by the end of the game, including Wright, who finally got some resolution for his character arc after 4 games of practically nothing. I wouldn't go quite as far as to say that it made up for Cold Steel's baffling reluctance to develop its main protagonist over the course of its 4 full-length JRPGs, but it was appreciated nonetheless. Side note, the fact that Reverie started out as a proper third Crossbell game implies that when they finished developing Cold Steel 4, they were content to just leave Wright's character arc as it was, which is absolutely insane to consider, but thankfully that didn't happen. I do have one noteworthy complaint about Reverie, which is that we have now reached unmanageable levels of cast bloat. Reverie brings back every major player from the Erebonia and Crossbell arcs, with a couple from Libero sprinkled in there for good measure. A feature that sounds cool on paper, but in execution fails both in terms of writing and gameplay. In terms of writing, only around half of the cast has a personal stake in the conflict, meaning that the other half of the cast is just kind of there. The writers at Falcom finally discovered the good sense not to have every character chime in at every major moment anymore, but this means that instead, the ones who don't have anything to say simply don't contribute anything. At that point, why have them there at all? I know this might seem like a bit of a hypocritical complaint, but really my point is that they should just have a smaller cast. A lot of the less important party members are fleshed out through the daydreams, and those do a great job of giving additional closure to those characters, but those characters didn't need to be playable in the main campaign in order for the daydreams to do that. Then in terms of gameplay, party composition is forcibly changed so often that it hardly feels worth adjusting members' kits when you know most of them will be swapped back out after an hour or 2 of gameplay. The thought of constantly maintaining every playable character's equipment is genuinely overwhelming, so I'm thankful that most of the game isn't actually built around having to do that. Overall though, the irrelevant cast members are by no means deal breakers, meaning that Reverie is the first Trails game I can recommend without any major reservations since really 0, save for the fact that you need to play all of the games that come before Reverie to really get much out of it. Who's Lila scratched that exact itch I had for a neat little indie mystery/horror game with its bizarre yet intriguing narrative, and ARG elements that strike the perfect balance between making the player go out of their way to see everything and not being too convoluted to follow. 2 complaints. 1, the point-and-click controls are not nearly responsive enough to carry 2 entire stealth sections. And 2, the game's main mechanic, that being the face-stretching feature, isn't as integral to the plot as the game's marketing would lead you to believe. The feature is totally superfluous to most of the more lore-intensive endings, which is a shame, because I think it's a really cool idea that could carry an entire game's worth of content, with or without the ARG stuff that I liked. Just food for thought. I've been thinking about Phoenix Wright as he appears in Apollo Justice Ace Attorney a lot lately. It's a fairly divisive interpretation of the character within the fandom, and I used to be on the side that thought that he could have worked if only he didn't revert back to his original self in Dual Destinies. But now replaying Apollo Justice Ace Attorney with its most recent re-release, I'm more of the opinion that this isn't a direction that works for this character at all. It makes perfect sense that Phoenix would become jaded after losing his badge and being forced to play poker for 7 years to make ends meet, but this version of Phoenix isn't just jaded, he's aloof, which is not a word I would use to describe Phoenix Wright at any point during the original trilogy. Seeing him casually leave his daughter to her own devices for extended periods of time, only popping in to spout something cryptic and generally uninterested sounding before leaving immediately after, is uncanny. It's not like Shu Takumi forgot how to write Phoenix either. In the flashback sequences during Turnabout Succession, he acts just like his old trilogy self. I bring all this up because I think in some way, my thoughts on this version of the character reflect my thoughts on Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as a whole. Much like Phoenix Wright in Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as a game is confused about what it's supposed to be. Turnabout Succession is an excellent mystery when viewed in isolation, and Christoph Gavin is an excellent villain, but as many others have pointed out, the final case of the game intended to introduce this new up-and-coming defense attorney as a key player in the series going forward is hardly about Apollo at all. The only time Apollo Justice Ace Attorney isn't about Phoenix Wright is during the game's Nothing Burger filler cases, which are entertaining in the typical Ace Attorney fashion, but don't do much to develop Apollo and Cliver in the same way that Phoenix and Edgeworth developed during the filler cases of Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. For a long while, I didn't really get the hype around Turnabout Trump, but now on my third time playing it, it finally clicked, and I got to see why so many think it's the best first case in the series, even if I personally think that 3-1 still tops it. I was excited to see what the rest of the game had in store, but Turnabout Succession is such a pivot from everything that happens in Turnabout Corner and Turnabout Serenade that I got kind of lost. Ultimately, I'm back where I started. I have a hard time viewing Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as anything but a setup for a sequel that never came. If we ever ended up getting follow-ups for the plot threads regarding Lamar and Kristoff, maybe I'd be singing a different tune. But as it stands, Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is simply less than the sum of its parts. When I first played Dual Destinies, I thought it was fine. That's equal parts praise and condemnation. On one hand, a good game is a good game, and Dual Destinies is undeniably a good game. On the other hand, Ace Attorney is a series that I tend to associate with a high bar of quality, and so when fine or good are the best words I have to describe it, it would be fair to say that in some regards the game missed the mark. Having replayed it now within the context of the Apollo Justice Trilogy re-release though, I think that Dual Destinies actually has a lot going for it. It just takes a few missteps along the way that holds it back from reaching its true potential. The best thing that Dual Destinies brings to the table is newcomer Athena Sykes. Despite the fact that she's only properly playable in one case, she's the narrative through line that links all of the game's cases together, and as such, Dual Destinies can more or less be considered her game. Would I have preferred it if the game was called Athena Sykes Ace Attorney and if Athena was a lead lawyer on every case? Yes, but even with things as they are, I would still argue that Athena gets more development than Apollo does in his own game. You can see how even in filler cases like Turnabout Academy, Athena has personal stakes that directly lead into her character growth, so I'm inclined to give the writers a pass on this one. Besides the fact that she's the core focus of the plot and has a decent character arc, Athena also brings with her my favorite lawyer gimmick in the series, the Mood Matrix, and personality-wise provides a nice contrast to Phoenix and Apollo with her spunky can-do attitude. That all being said, this brings me to my first major complaint with Dual Destinies, which is that I think the writers underutilized Athena and Simon's personal connection prior to the final case. Part of what makes the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney so compelling, in spite of the fact that it's nowhere near my favorite entry in the series, is in how Shu Takumi uses Phoenix and Edgeworth to develop each other over the course of the narrative. Even though the details of their connection aren't revealed until that game's climax, you can still feel it through their heated interactions. Not so in Dual Destinies. Athena and Simon appear to be almost perfect strangers until the end of the game. You could argue that this is because Athena doesn't take the lead on every case, but I don't think it would have been that hard for them to drop in more personal taunts here and there earlier on in the game. My other major complaint with Dual Destinies is that I think they should have shown Apollo's side of the investigation during Turnabout for Tomorrow. We don't get any major Apollo development until the end of the second game in the so-called Apollo Justice Trilogy, and even then, we only get to see the resolution of his arc in this game. Opting to develop Apollo's suspicions in real time instead of having the setup happen off-screen would have done wonders for his character arc. It's the final case of the game, so it's not like having things be a little more elaborate would be out of place, and they wouldn't have had to get rid of Phoenix's section either. In fact, I think showing the contrasting perspectives would have only served to further demonstrate Apollo's inner turmoil. As it stands though, this replay of Dual Destinies has done little to shake my impression of Apollo as much more than a slightly grouchier, more cynical Phoenix Wright. So as you can see, I've been playing a lot of Ace Attorney recently, what with the Apollo Justice Trilogy re-release, and in fact next month's video will almost definitely include a review of Spirit of Justice, so watch out for that. And of course, here is the updated list of game rankings for the year. Hope you guys enjoyed the reviews, see y'all next time.